Doing Anti-Racism Toward an Egalitarian American Society by Jacqueline Johnson, Sharon Rush, and Joe Fagan. In this chapter, the authors provide a utopian vision of how racial inequality could be lessened in the United States. They address primarily macro-level social changes of institutions and in the larger political and cultural values of the society. However, Johnson and colleagues also advocate social change at the micro level of individuals and social interaction. Specifically, the authors talk about how individuals first need to have sympathy for or care about a group that is different from them. For example, whites need to care about issues of racism that people of color may be experiencing, and wealthy people need to be concerned about homeless individuals in their communities. But sympathy is not enough. Individuals also need to feel empathy for others to really enact social change. To feel empathy for someone who is different from you means that not only that you care about them, but that you can feel their pain. There is a deeper emotional connection that motivates you to act on their behalf. Finally, Johnson and colleagues argue that after individuals feel sympathy and empathy for people who are different from them, the final stage is transformative knowledge. Individuals are then able to educate themselves and act toward changing the situations that are creating the oppression or unfair privilege. A non-racist society cannot be achieved if whites continue to deny the reality of the racist society and the racism within themselves. The painful emotional work of actually undoing individual racism must be accomplished in combination with collective efforts for structural change. The author's first suggestion for beginning to eliminate institutionalized racism is to call for a new constitutional convention, one that will represent fairly and equally, for the first time, all major groups of U.S. citizens. What might the social, political, and economic landscape of the United States look like if we started with a social system constructed to actually meet the ideals of democracy and humanity rather than the goals of privilege maintenance and social and racial hierarchies? A combination of barriers to receiving full equality under the Constitution for women and people of color, and their lack of representation in the original drafting of the Constitution, and their lack of representation in interpreting the Constitution, and the continuing adherence to originalism and the arduous process of constitutional amendment all speak to the urgency of a new constitutional convention. The central goals of this convention are to assert the basic human rights to those previously excluded and oppressed, and to ensure that the governing document of the new multiracial and soon-to-be non-racist democracy is produced by representatives of all people. As a starting point, this new convention might make use of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights and beginning debates on the egalitarian democracy. The declaration, now supported by most nations, indicates a growing consensus across the globe that human rights are essential to a healthy society. A truly democratic constitution would be the political basis on which to build an array of new democratic institutions. There are many necessary steps to this political utopia. A new democratic government will need to take determined action to redress past oppression if it is to create a truly non-racist egalitarian society. It must aggressively pursue desegregation, or better, meaningful reciprocal racial, class, and gender integration in schooling, housing, healthcare, employment, politics, and public accommodations. Private efforts will also need to be made to desegregate voluntary associations, including the now highly segregated churches, synagogues, and mosques of this nation. The new democratic governments will also need to go far beyond conventional desegregation solutions. For more than a century now, Black leaders have called for reparations for the racist oppressions that African Americans have suffered for 15 generations. The new democratic governments will also need to take action to compensate Native Americans for the land stolen from them and to compensate other Americans of color for the land and labor taken from them. Another step of the author's vision of a non-racist egalitarian society is the re-education of white and other Americans to address the previous and current miseducation about racial differences and racial history. The new education cannot be launched in schools alone, but must also involve all structures that actively communicate and reinforce information about racial matters and racial ideology. This includes structures of mass communication, structures that facilitate the intergenerational transference of knowledge, and other social structures that have been used to reinforce racist dogma and white notions of privilege. Challenging the way that the public schools are supported is one way to attack segregation. The current system, where public schools are funded largely by local taxes, guaranteed social inequality, segregation, and continued racism across large areas of cities and states. This system reinforces white notions of entitlement and privilege by linking wealth routinely to educational quality. What was once considered overtly racist white flight to avoid desegregated schools and neighborhoods has now been reconceptualized as the socially conscious attempts of white parents to build a better life for their children. But often what makes this life better is their limited contact with people of color. Indeed, long before the development of biological racism, Christianity was used to rationalize inequalities such as the enslavement of Africans. Consequently, it is no accident that most modern-day white supremacist groups use a religious framework to support their racist dogma. Most Western religions divide the world into those who are divinely privileged and those who are divinely oppressed. Members of a non-racist utopian society would enjoy a common human spirituality grounded in the universal tenets of humanity. Perhaps the most important tenets are assertions of the rights of every human being to be as free as possible from suffering and to enjoy a life of freedom and happiness. The authors envision also all pro-utopian individuals actively doing active anti-racism. To some degree, most Americans of color are forced routinely to engage in anti-racism work, at least in regard to their own group. These Americans of color may need to expand their activities to include the discrimination faced by other groups of color. But the most challenging task is to move significant numbers of whites into anti-racist actions and activism. This means that whites must move out of their present comfort zones to confront personally the painful and usually emotional work of doing anti-racism every day. The non-racist organizations deal with an individual prejudice and stereotyping and with the reality of an institutional racism. A next step in a broad non-racist strategy for the United States would be to expand the number of these non-racist organizations and to connect them into a national and international network of all peoples working against systemic racism in this and other societies across the globe. To effect a genuine move away from racism and toward the non-racist egalitarian utopia, these well-intentioned whites must understand their own racism and that of society. They must combat institutional racism, the racism built into every facet of American life. Non-racist organizations deal with individual prejudice and stereotyping and with the reality of institutional racism. A next step in the broad non-racist strategy for the United States would be to expand the number of these non-racist organizations and to connect them into a national and international network of all people working against systemic racism in this and other societies across the globe. To effect a genuine move away from racism and toward the non-racist egalitarian utopia, these well-intentioned whites must understand their own racism and that of the society. They must also combat institutional racism, the racism built into every facet of American life. Unlike most whites today, however, a white person committed to the non-racist utopia would be filled with a very deep and lasting respect for all human beings as equals, including those who are physically or culturally different. Respect, not just tolerance, is a necessary emotional orientation, because the primary goals of the non-racist utopian society are to eliminate unnecessary suffering and to create the rights to life, liberty, and human happiness so eloquently asserted in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. People therein would be motivated to treat each other equally with dignity and respect. Moving to the ideal non-racist society will require much work on the cognitive and emotional aspects of contemporary racism. However, whites' identification with oppression on the other side of the color line can develop through at least 3 different strategies: sympathy, empathy, and what might be called transformative insight. The initial stage, sympathy, is important but limited. It usually involves the willingness to set aside some of the racist stereotyping and hostility taught in white communities and the development of a friendly interest in what is happening to the racial other. Empathy is a much more advanced stage, in that it requires the ability to reject distancing stereotypes and a heightened and sustained capacity to see and feel the pain of the racial others. Empathy involves the capacity to sense deeply the character of another's pain and to act on that sensitivity. Transformative insight is also more likely to develop in loving and caring interracial relationships. Interpersonal love characterizes most relationships in which people care deeply about each other. Transformative insight or transformative love is most likely to develop in people who are loving relationships that challenge institutional norms about power distributions. The transformative insight includes a clear understanding of the broad range of privileges that comes from being white in a racist society, privileges a person has whether she or he wants them or not. Unlearning racism and the essential emotional work to eliminate individual racism are essential steps in becoming an effective non-racist activist. Non-racist activists cannot interact merely within limited social circles. They must actively work to break down existing structures that maintain and reproduce inequality. It is not enough to acknowledge differences or to be tolerant of others. A new anti-racist must acknowledge the real pain and the white privilege embedded in the existing system, must be willing to give up much privilege, and must work actively to create more egalitarian structures. This is tough work emotionally, spiritually, and physically, but it is ultimately crucial for the construction of a non-racist utopia.